So the part that Kent neglected to mention was the fact that I only wrote the Perryville book because he talked me into it. And by talking me into it, I mean he called me up on the phone and wouldn't stop talking until I agreed to do it. I had more excuses than you can imagine, including I'm not really a military historian, but by the time I got off the phone, I felt like I was committed. So the book exists, and a lot of the good things in my career exist because of Kent Brown, and I am incredibly appreciative of that. I'm also very happy to be speaking to all of you tonight. This is actually the third time I've spoken to this roundtable. I don't know what it is about me. Usually people only invite me once, but somebody keeps inviting me back here, and it's always very special for me to be in Lexington. My wife Nancy is with me tonight. We actually met here in Lexington. I probably shouldn't say when, but it was in the Patterson office tower a long time ago. So Lexington holds a very special place for me. And finally, I want to congratulate you. It's just remarkable to see so many of you here. Roundtables around the country are not in good shape. I can't remember the last time I spoke to a group this large. So good for you, and good for your officers. The Howling Storm, Weather, Climate, and the American Civil War. This is a talk I've given on Zoom a few times, or YouTube or Facebook during our COVID year. But it's only actually the second time I've spoken face-to-face with actual, real human beings in a couple of years now. I was actually supposed to do it one other time. About a month ago, I got on a plane, which in itself was very, very strange after 2 years of not flying. And I went down to New Orleans to speak to New Orleans Civil War Roundtable. And as you may know, New Orleans always shares its speakers with Austin, Texas. So I was going to do New Orleans the first night and Austin the second. So we got to the venue. They actually don't meet in New Orleans anymore. They meet out in Metairie. And the waitress came by and said, well, you're the speaker. Why don't we go ahead and let you eat first? And that way everyone else can have dessert during your speech. You can eat your dessert during my speech, by the way, if you want. So I came out and I ate, and they were just starting to bring dinner to everybody else. And the waitress came out again, and she said, I'm sorry, we have to evacuate the building. There's a fire in the kitchen. So I thought, oh my, a grease fire. There's a fire in the kitchen. So we all went outside. And no, it wasn't just a kitchen fire. It was coming through the roof, as you can see here, at Bistro Orleans. I did not speak that night. I offered to in the parking lot, but many of them were just, sort of running past me and jumping into their cars. So I went to Austin the next night, and word of this had preceded me. So I got to the venue in Austin. It's a very nice little restaurant. And the owner came over and said to me, and I quote, please don't burn down my restaurant. I hope all of you know how lucky you are right now. As far as I can tell, this hotel is still not on fire. So having said that, let's talk about the impact of weather and climate in the Civil War. And I thought I would start with sort of an unusual place. I thought I would start with how I came up with the title. Now, as Kent said, I have written or edited 8 books. And 4 of them have titles I actually like. Because once publishers get a hold of your manuscript, they pass it on to the marketing folks. And half the time in my life, the marketing folks had said, we can't sell a book with that title. So you end up with a title that they think will help with sales. I don't want to say what publisher or what book, but one of my books actually has a title that I begged them not to use, but they did anyway. So that's how publishing works. It was a little different with Howling Storm because I couldn't think of a title, or at least every time I came up with a title, a book would come out 3 months later with that title and I would be back to square one. So there I was. I'd written the book. I'd finished the book. It was supposed to be 2 volumes. The press decided at the last minute that it needed to be a 1-volume book. So there I was going through, cutting out about 300 pages of a 1,200-page manuscript. I mean, it's still a monster, but it was going to be bigger. And I'm going through it, and I'm doing the final editing, and I don't have a title. What on earth am I supposed to do? Well, of course, I ended up with the title. How did that happen? I was editing. I was going through chapter by chapter, and I came across a quotation from, that's Henry Kyd Douglas, as I'm sure a lot of you know, talking about the night of the Battle of Malvern Hill, the last of the 7 days battles in summer of 1862. And I don't know how many times I had read this passage, but at that moment, it struck me that I couldn't come up with anything that would do a better job of trying to explain what this book was about. So this is the quotation. I know how boring it is when people read to you from PowerPoint, but I'm going to break that rule once and do so. It had rained incessantly, almost every other day, throughout the Peninsula Campaign, to a degree that I don't think we understand. Every time I hear somebody say that George McClellan was simply timid or coward, I remind them now of the logistical reality that the Army of the Potomac faced going up that peninsula. Well, the rain pretty much stopped right before the 7 days battles. There were thunderstorms. It got really hot. And then the night of Malvern Hill, the rain came back, and it just poured during that retreat of the Federal Army down to Harrison's Landing. And over on the Confederate side, Henry Kyd Douglas, who was an aide to Stonewall Jackson at that moment, remembered the howling of the storm, the cry of the wounded, and the groans of the dying, the glare of the torch upon the faces of the dead, or into the shining eyes of the speechless wounded, looking up in hope of relief, the ground slippery with a mixture of mud and blood, all in the dark, hopeless, starless night. Surely it was a gruesome picture of war at its most horrid shape. Now, I've argued for years, going back to my Perryville book, in fact, that we have a sad tendency to minimize the darkness and the hopelessness and the gruesomeness of that war. But what struck me in this quotation as I was trying to find a title was how we have almost forgotten half of what Douglas writes about. We remember the blood, we remember the fighting, we don't always remember the mud, the slippery field, the pouring rain as men went about trying to secure their wounded and find their friends. And I think if I only had 5 minutes tonight, I could almost just stop here, because in a way that's what the book is about. Trying to bring the mud back into our understanding of the American Civil War. And let me tell you another story. I've been working on this project for about 12 years now, and the first time I ever talked about it in public was to a group in Athens, Georgia. And I thought I would lead off with a joke, right? And as it turned out, nothing had burned down in the previous month. So, yeah. So I came up with what I thought was a pretty funny line. I got up in front of this group, and I said, the Civil War was fought outside. And no one laughed. just like no one laughed just now. Which is okay now because I have come to realize somehow I had come up with a very serious statement. I think it's easy for all of us in our ballrooms, our classrooms, our dens, our basements, our offices, with the heat or the air conditioning on. It's easy for us to forget that the Civil War was largely fought outside, in the weather, in the environment, in the mud, in the dust, in the snow, by a generation that spent most of its time outdoors. They weren't like us. They were outside most of the time. They understood the world a little differently than we do. And when they wrote all those memoirs, and when they wrote those regimental histories, they just assumed that future generations would be like them and that they would understand that the Civil War took place in an environmental context. The most famous example, of course, being the Mud March at Fredericksburg, which you see here and which ended up on the book. But there were smaller examples that took place every day. I started to read beyond Civil War history. I ended up reading all sorts of things like geology, soil mechanics, meteorology, talking to colleagues in my field, notably environmental historians, learning a lot from them, trying to understand how could I tell the story of the environmental context, the weather context in particular, of the American Civil War. I learned from the environmental historians, for example, that they assign to the environment what they call agency. And that doesn't mean that the weather had a brain, an agenda, a plan. Obviously it doesn't. But it's an active player in history as well as in the present. And so I started to think of the Civil War differently. Not as that classic contest between the blue and the gray that we all grew up with, but to see it as a struggle between the blue, the gray, and the weather. And the weather as almost a third non-aligned power, which, to jump forward to the end of the book, the end of the project, usually, but not always, supported the Union cause. There are some notable examples when weather was very fickle and the alliance broke down and would support the Confederacy, like on the Peninsula, or the retreat from Gettysburg. But thinking of the Civil War in this manner, as not just a contest between men, but as a contest between men and the environment, really forced me to think about all of it differently. Now, I have to confess, I've been thinking about those questions for a while, and Kent has very graciously, again, referred to my Perryville book. And we're in Kentucky, so all of you know Perryville. And there was that day when Kent called me and talked me into writing the Perryville book. I'd been to Perryville before, obviously. I've told this story before to this group. That when I met my wife, X number of years ago, I guess she really liked me because she wanted to impress me. So as a Kentuckian, she drove me down to Perryville. The way to a Civil War buff's heart is through a battlefield. So I've been thinking about Perryville for a long time, but I can't say that I was an expert when I started writing that book. There was a lot I needed to learn. And one of the first things that struck me in my research, and I think it's one of the most important things you can know about the Battle of Perryville, when you go on that tour with Kent, one of the things you want to keep in mind was that that entire campaign took place in a drought. a serious drought. A drought that affected the Western theater so much that when Buell's army got into Louisville, some of his Hoosiers were fed up with him and decided to desert by walking home across the Ohio River. They walked across the falls and kept walking. That's how low the Ohio was. The entire campaign was shaped by drought. Bragg's path into Kentucky altered and changed because of drought. The Confederates decided to hold the line at Perryville because there was water there. The battle itself began as a contest over water. You can't understand the Battle of Perryville unless you understand that drought that surrounded it. And it started to occur to me, kind of slowly, I'm not the quickest person in the world, I guess. It started to occur to me over the years that if that was true at Perryville, surely it was true elsewhere. When I got my first job in 1990, teaching at what was then called West Georgia College, one of my colleagues came up to me and said, "So are you going to be a teacher or a researcher? Because you can't be both." And I said, "No, I'm going to be both." And I believed, and I still believe to this day, now that I'm retired, that our teaching and our research has to inform the other. So as I'm researching Perryville, it's changing the way I teach my Civil War class. I talk about the drought. I discover how long that drought lasted. I discover that it's still affecting Rosecrans in Nashville at the end of the year. But I also started talking about the heavy rains that came earlier in 1862. The rain that shaped Fort Henry and Fort Donelson and Shiloh and the Peninsula Campaign. Where did all that rain come from? Why was it raining so hard? Why were my sources telling soldiers, we've never had a year like this. We've never seen so much rain, or we've never seen so much drought. So Perryville really did put me on the path to writing Howling Storm, because that campaign made me think about understanding the Civil War in its weather context, in its environmental context. That's not to say that I'm the first person to ever do that, because that would absolutely not be true. Lots of people have written about weather in the American Civil War. What I would suggest, though, is that we haven't done a very good job of connecting the dots. Y'all remember doing those connect the dots coloring books when you were little? Connect the dots and then color it in. Over the years, over 150 plus years, we have thrown a lot of dots up there about weather in the American Civil War. We just haven't done a very good job of connecting them. Soldiers themselves write a lot about the weather. Marcus Woodcock, the book you see in the upper left. First time I ever spoke to this group was about Marcus Woodcock. He wrote about the weather. A lot of soldiers wrote about the weather. Bud Robertson once told me that nothing was more frustrating than finally tracking down a letter collection or a diary from the Stonewall Brigade and discovering that all the guy wrote about was weather. That wasn't useful for what he was doing. But they were writing about weather to the degree that I had to find a way early in this project of limiting my sources, finding out what the best weather sources were from soldiers. But they wrote about it. Of course they did. They lived out in it. And they remembered it very well, more so than you might think. Historians who have written about battles write about the weather. I write about the drought in Perryville. Kent writes about the heavy rain after Gettysburg in his retreat book. Impossible to understand the retreat unless you understand the rain. Professor Amy Taylor over at the university here in Lexington has written about refugee camps in the war, and has written in part about how Cold weather, a cold snap at Camp Nelson changed the Lincoln administration's policy toward the freed people and their families. You probably know the basics of the story. There were a lot of freed people getting trained down at Camp Nelson. They brought their wives and their kids with them. They were afraid to leave them behind. Speed Fry was in command. He threw them out. The weather turned cold. Some of them died. Children died, freezing to death outside of Camp Nelson. The outrage that greeted that incident completely changed military policy when it came to USCT troops and their families coming into camps. Classic books about Civil War soldiers, like Bill Wiley's, talk about how soldiers dealt with the weather, what their winter shelters were like, how did they try to get through the winter. And we see it in popular culture all the time. I imagine pretty much everybody here has seen Glory. There are a lot of amazing scenes in Glory, but the one that always strikes me is the night that Colonel Shaw learns that the Confederate government is going to treat his men, if captured, as runaway slaves and execute the officers as leading slave rebellion. Shaw goes out and tells his men. And in that scene in Glory, remember, the rain is just pouring. And there's Morgan Freeman in character, marching back and forth in that rain as we in the audience wait to see how many of them will be there the next morning. And of course, they're all there the next morning as the storm breaks. So we know these scenes. We go to battlefields. We know about the weather that took place at Perryville here in the lower left or elsewhere. We deal with it when we go now. The fellow here in Confederate uniform is my friend Darrell Black. Darrell Black, until fairly recently, the president of the Seminary Ridge Museum, but also one of the first authentic, so-called authentic reenactors when that hobby really started to take out. How many of you have read Tony Horowitz's Confederates in the Attic? Remember the reenactor Rob Hodge that Tony Horowitz writes about a lot? Darrell Black's the guy who got Rob Hodge interested in reenacting. And I asked him once, I said, when you're out doing a presentation to the public, what's the number one question they ask you? And he said, oh, that's easy. Aren't those wool uniforms hot? And we always assume what? 19th century people were so different than us that they were perfectly comfortable walking around in wool uniforms in the summer. Wow, those guys were tough. Well, actually, every campaign that took place in the summer during the Civil War saw hundreds and hundreds of men drop out, fall along the wayside, get sick, go to hospital, die of heat stroke because they were wearing those wool uniforms. They really are hot. And yet we have all of this. We have the memoirs, we have the regimental histories, we have the battle narratives, we have all of this. And yet somehow we neglected to put it together and to look at it across the war and to see what it meant. Douglas Southall Freeman, a name all of you know. You see Freeman down here, the lower half of the slide. Freeman died in 1953. About a month before he died, he gave his last public address. And in that address, among other things, he pointed out that Civil War historians, and this is a Pulitzer Prize historian, this is one of the great historians of his time, we actually know next to nothing about what weather was like in the Civil War. He says, I've written about Lee for 4 years. I have no idea what the temperatures were. How hot was it really? How cold was it really at Fredericksburg? And what we need to do is we need to start a concerted effort over the next 5 or 6 years of finding that data and putting it together so that we can actually, for the first time, know the hard reality of what Civil War weather was like. And then we can determine if it mattered. Now, as it turned out, it didn't take 5 years to do that. It took decades. Many of you probably know Robert Crick, A few years ago, Crick put out a book called Civil War Weather in Virginia. It's a wonderful book. I recommend it to all of you. But I will tell you, it's basically an almanac. Day by day, temperatures in Virginia, so that you could finally do what Freeman would have loved to have done in the 30s and 40s and have a sense of what weather was like during the campaigns of Lee. Bob Crick was able to do that because he discovered a remarkable source sitting in the National Archives, and it's there to this day. It's on microfilm. You can go look at it yourself if you want to. In the 1840s, the Smithsonian Institution decided to create a national program of weather data collection. Joseph Henry, who was the president of the Smithsonian, had this crazy idea that weather in one part of the country might affect weather somewhere else in the country. Bear in mind all the things we hear on the local news about warm fronts and cold fronts and all of that. Nobody knew about those until the 20th century. So they're just trying to collect data. So maybe someday they can sit down and compare it and see if there are patterns to that data. So the Smithsonian would cut you a deal. If you would be willing to take weather observations 3 times a day, every day, 7 a.m., 2 p.m., 9 p.m., they would send you all of the instruments you needed. And you could go out there with top-notch scientific instruments for the 1840s or 50s and record data, and all you had to do was send a report once a month to Washington. So from 1844 until 1861, there was a nationwide system of weather information collection. When the war began, it generally fell apart in the Confederacy. The Confederacy actually talked about trying to create their own program. They never got around to it. They were busy. But it continued elsewhere. And there were actually people still in the Confederacy who were collecting their data and somehow getting it to Washington every month. And I have no idea how they did it. But this actually went on. And so we have a lot more hard data than Douglas Southall Freeman ever dreamed existed. It's very thorough for the war in the East. Bob Crick's book is largely based on the records of one of these weather observers, a minister in Georgetown named C.B. Mackey. It's a little more scattered in the Western theater, but you can kind of put things together. It's almost impossible to find for the Trans-Mississippi, unfortunately, aside from selected moments. Like Sibley's campaign into New Mexico, we actually have some good records for that. And there those records sat in the National Archives, along with records that the U.S. Army put together. Army surgeons were supposed to collect weather data. Not a lot of it has survived, but some of it has. On ships, U.S. Navy deck officers were supposed to record weather several times a day. Again, they did a really great job of that in the East. Records for the blockading squadrons are really good. Unfortunately, once they got into those ironclads and were going up and down the Mississippi or the Tennessee or the Ohio, apparently they forgot. Because you start looking through those logbooks, and trust me, I've been through those logbooks, and they'll say things like, warm. But we have these records that the Civil War community as a whole has rarely utilized. And these weather observers themselves were just a remarkable group of people. Usually, not always, usually ministers or teachers or professors, or sometimes both. Like Orman Beatty down at Center College. He gave us all sorts of wonderful data for the Perryville campaign. He was one of them. A guy named William Stewart, Clarksville, Tennessee. He gives us a pretty good idea of how much it really did rain at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. One of my favorites, someone Kent knows well, Michael Jacobs, who was a professor at Gettysburg, at Pennsylvania College. I sometimes wonder about Michael Jacobs. I've been to his house. You're supposed to collect weather data every day, 7 a.m., 2 p.m., 9 p.m. So what was Michael Jacobs doing on July 1st, 1863? Collecting his data. Even at 2 o'clock when Ewell's Confederates were running past his house. I can only assume he's out in the backyard. They were a pretty devoted group of people. Robert McCrary, who was the Smithsonian weather observer in Natchez, Mississippi, born into slavery. How he got that position, I still don't know. But there's a wonderful story there to be told about the amazing Robert McCrary. So we have a lot of data. We have more than we've ever realized. Thanks to folks like Bob Crick, who found these records. And I used a lot of them in writing Howling Storm when I could. So what? What I want to do is talk a little bit about weather in the war generally, and then go to some specifics. And give you a sense of why I think this is important. I almost feel like I'm speaking as an evangelist tonight, trying to convince you that you need to think about the Civil War, a little bit at least, in this way. Here's the first thing you want to know about weather during the Civil War. I'm going to use the technical term here. It was weird. It was not normal. It was not average. It was not something that you can say, well, we know what the weather was like in July in Alabama, and I don't have to think about it anymore. I'm not sure weather is ever normal. Sometimes we sort of take all the averages from year to year and lump them together, and we call that climate. We have a sense of what the climate's like in Kentucky in March. But these were very unusual years, and I will tell you that meteorologists who are interested in historical meteorology, a science I did not even know existed until a few years ago, they're still not sure what was going on in these years, but clearly there was. First of all, there was a massive drought in the western half of the modern United States between about 1845 and 1865. And it got specifically even worse in the years right before the Civil War, in what meteorologists routinely call the Great Civil War Drought. I remember the first time I read about that, I was stunned. Meteorologists are sitting around talking about the Great Civil War Drought. I didn't know a Civil War historian on earth who had ever heard of the Great Civil War Drought. But there it was. There was a time in the early 1840s when the Comanche Empire was so strong that it was able to hold off both the Mexican Army and the United States Army. What changed for the Comanche? The drought hit. It was an entire culture built on buffalo. Buffalo have to eat grass. The grass started to die. The Comanche Empire fell apart, and the Mexican Army and the U.S. Army was able to move in and take their territory. As you approach the Civil War, this drought is continuing in places like Kansas, Texas, the Indian territories, which are so devastated by 1861 that many of the nations out there, the relocated nations of the Southeast, embrace the Confederacy just because they feel like they've been abandoned by Washington. In this drought, they're starving. There are exceptions. Massive flood hit the West Coast, December 61, January 62, flooding much of California, all the way up to Alaska, all the way down into Southern California, but especially Northern California and Oregon. Flooding so severe that that fabled California column of Union troops was trapped and couldn't get to New Mexico to fight Sibley until Sibley was on his way out. Had they arrived a few weeks earlier, the history of that campaign might have been very different. But they couldn't get there because of the mega flood. It rained more in December 1861 in Sacramento, California than it has since. The only year that came close was this last year. So that's unusual. Our local TV meteorologists often talk about something called El Nino, the El Nino phenomenon, which you see demonstrated here on the graph to the top. In a normal year, the weather off the coast of South America, especially Peru, Ecuador, is pretty darn cold because the trade winds are moving from east to west, warming the waters of modern Indonesia and northern Australia. But some years, for reasons that no one understands, those trade winds shift. Warm water starts moving from west to east toward South America, and it warms up the ocean. Not a lot, 4 or 5 degrees. Waves toss up that extra moist heat. It gets up into the air. It gets up into the stratosphere. Wind patterns change. The jet stream moves. Weather changes around the world. It's pretty well agreed that 1861 was not just a normal year, it was a super exaggerated normal year, which we now call La Nina. Hot and dry southern summers, cold northeastern winters. Think about all the men who died of sunstroke and heat stroke on the way to the Wilson's Creek battlefield with temperatures over 100 degrees in a La Nina year. Now, there used to be a school of thought that La Nina extended throughout the Civil War, but more recently, historical meteorologists, I'll mention them, Richard Grove, George Adamson, believed that El Nino years took place starting in December of 1861 through most of 1862, starting in December of 63 through 1864, and then starting again at the end of 1865 and stretching into the first real years of Reconstruction. And what you get in an El Nino year, in the South at least, are cold and rainy winters. Now, the folks on TV will talk a lot about El Nino, but usually what they don't talk about is another phenomenon that's taking place out in the Atlantic called the North Atlantic Oscillation. You see that at sort of the bottom there. There's a permanent low pressure system around Iceland, and there's a permanent high pressure system around the Azores in the Atlantic. But sometimes the differences between those pressure readings become wider or become more narrow. When they become more narrow, that's called a negative North Atlantic oscillation. And it produces, among other things, cold and heavy snow in the south. Also in Western Europe. Napoleon invaded Russia during a negative North Atlantic oscillation year. The Battle of the Bulge was fought in a negative North Atlantic oscillation year. 1862, 1864, and 1865 were negative North Atlantic oscillation years. And if you put that together with what's happening to the west with El Nino, what you get is some incredibly unusual and volatile weather. Now, I've been talking in generalities here, and at this point you're thinking, isn't this a Civil War roundtable? Shouldn't we be talking about the war as opposed to meteorology? And I wouldn't blame you if you're thinking about that, but I wanted to tell you these basics so that you can get a sense of what happens during the war itself. If we work our way through the Civil War, what do we find? We find that the summer and fall of 1861 was unusually hot. Manassas, Wilson's Creek, as I mentioned. In December of 1861, that first El Nino takes off. So there's snow at the beginning of the month, but then December of 1861 got unusually warm. And by unusual, I mean people were writing back and forth in their letters. Flowers are blooming in December. Mama says she's never seen this before. We don't know what's happening. We've never experienced such a warm December. It turned a little colder around December 21st, 22nd, but it still stayed warm enough for Stonewall Jackson to think to himself, I think I can move my little army up toward Bath and Romney and maybe the Potomac and drive those Yankees out and safeguard Winchester. And so on the last day of December, his army marched, and it was so warm, his men were throwing away their coats, which was a fatal decision for some of them because it turned cold that night. It turned incredibly cold that night. The early months of 1862 were colder than usual and very, very wet with snow and rain farther south. To the degree, and I've done this, I've been through newspapers from all across the Confederacy and across the North as well, but especially in the Confederacy. Farmers were getting their crops into the field, in some cases, a month later than they usually did. In places like South Carolina, there was so much rain that they had to plow up their crops and start over. So there's a lot of rain. And there's my Fort Henry rain. There's my Shiloh rain. There's my Peninsula Campaign rain, growing out of this phenomenon. And then it stopped, especially west of the Appalachians, but even east of the mountains, drought sets in around June or July. And there's Perryville. And there's eventually Stones River. And there's Antietam. And yes, Antietam Creek was so low in 1862 that you can't go there now and think about what you would have done if you were Ambrose Burnside, because that creek was lower than you would generally find it today. The banks are still just as steep, but the water was lower. And those farmers back home in the Confederacy not only got their crops in a month late, but now they're out there dying in the fields because there's not enough rain in the summer and fall, which created a massive food shortage across much of the Confederacy. What happened in 1863? Same thing. It happened again. Same pattern. 1864, the summer drought just shifted north. Missouri, Virginia again. Virginia got hit 3 years in a row by this unusual drought. But now it shifts into the northern states, cutting food production across the Union. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, we were taught that one of the reasons the North won the war was because the Confederates had depended on King Cotton, but the North had depended on King Wheat. And you know, with all those reaping machines and all that marvelous technology, the North was able to keep producing food. Best year in the northern states for food production was 1862. It went down after that. Dipped significantly in 63, popped back up a little bit in 1864. There were enough food shortages in the North in the summer and fall of 1864 that it became an issue in Abraham Lincoln's re-election campaign. We need our boys back home, the Democrats said, growing food for us because we're going to go hungry otherwise. And one of the first things the new Department of Agriculture ever does is start producing statistics to tell the North, we're okay. And then there are the unusual events, like early frosts. At the end of August 1863, in the middle of September 1863, massive frost events came out of Canada, swept across the Midwest toward the south. In Champaign County, Illinois, where I live today, a so-called black frost killed half of the harvest in the fields when that second frost came through in the middle of September. And it kept going all the way to Chickamauga Creek, where those two armies had been lining up to fight each other in very warm weather. And then the night before Chickamauga, as I'm sure many of you know, The bottom fell out of the temperatures. It was cold. And the men who were wounded in the first day of Chickamauga and the second often froze to death between the combination of cold weather and their wounds. January 1st, 1862, west of the Appalachians, the coldest day of the American Civil War. January 2nd, the next day, if you were on the East Coast. There were people still alive in the 1930s and 1940s, older people, who remembered what everybody in the Midwest at least called the cold New Year. It was so cold, everybody remembered. People froze to death in the streets of major cities. They died on trains that got stuck in the snow. Soldiers wrote about it. Certainly James Longstreet's soldiers in East Tennessee wrote about it, trying to survive without proper shoes, proper clothing, and then this happened. It certainly affected them. One thing I want to stress to you, very often, at least on the academic side of the American Civil War, we talk about one of those big questions. We like to throw big questions out in our seminars and let our graduate students argue about them. And one of the questions we talk about is, why did the Confederacy lose? Well, there are two basic answers to why the Confederacy lost. And one of those answers we call internalism, the internalist argument. It's the notion that the Confederacy was never particularly very strong and it imploded from within. That too many people in the Confederacy, African Americans, the poor, women, turned against the Confederacy for various reasons. And usually we point to policies that came out of Richmond, impressment of farm crops, the tax in kind, which allowed the Confederate government to take a tenth of everybody's farm production, which was okay if you were a big planter, but if you're a woman trying to keep the farm going while your husband's at war, that tenth might be the difference between survival and starvation. And people wonder, what on earth was going on with the Confederates doing this? And with the exception of the late Paul Gates, who wrote about this in the 1960s, and the late Armstead Robinson, who died before he could finish his magnum opus, most historians who consider themselves internalists do not know anything about these heavy rains in the spring and these droughts in the summer and fall, which means they don't understand why it happened in the first place. The Confederate government at a certain point had to make a desperate but completely understandable decision. We don't have enough food. Who do we prioritize? Our armies or our civilian population? And the Davis administration and the majority of Congress made the decision that they had to prioritize the Army, because if the Army fell apart, there would be no Confederacy, which didn't make a lot of people happy at home. We have article after article and book after book about things like the Richmond bread riots, without understanding how little food there was around Richmond, and how flooding the week before the bread riots knocked out all the bridges into Richmond, which meant the little food that was out there in the country, nobody could get into the city. Why were women revolting against the Davis administration? Because there was no food. Because the James had flooded. And all those farms out in the countryside had flooded as well. So if you're an internalist, you have to start with the weather. But what if you're not? There's a competing school of thought that says the Confederacy was generally pretty united, at least among the white population. Confederacy didn't implode, it was defeated. It was crushed from outside by stronger, more powerful Union armies, which is exactly what R.E. Lee said at Appomattox in April of 1865. We've lost overwhelming numbers and resources. External forces. Externalism. So maybe that's what you think. But if you're an externalist, you still have to think about the weather. You have to think about the sleet and snow at Fort Donelson. You have to think about the rain after Gettysburg that not only flooded the Potomac to the point that Lee almost couldn't get across, but, as I would argue, impeded George Meade to the point that There wasn't much he could do about it anyway, despite what the White House thought. Or the rain at Mill Springs, a battle that many of you know. My friend Stuart Sanders has written about Mill Springs and how many Confederates at Mill Springs were equipped with old flintlocks, which simply would not work in misty, damp, rainy weather. We can argue about percentages, but it's clear that a sizable percentage of Confederates at Mill Springs, 20 to 40%, had shoulder arms that literally would not work because of the weather that day, which is how they could stand there at that fence and just keep shooting at each other, because a lot of them weren't shooting. The heat that characterizes so many summer campaigns, like Jubal Early's campaign into Maryland and toward Washington in 1864. Early gets to Washington. Famously, he can't get into the city. Abraham Lincoln goes out to watch. And then you start looking at Early's campaign and realizing that the temperatures were generally over 100. Everyone wrote that the dust clouds were massive. Early lost hundreds of men every hour on the march to Washington and had to slow down his line of march and eventually stop early. Early had to stop early. In his attempt to take the Capitol and embarrass the Lincoln administration. If the weather's a little better, maybe Early gets there a day earlier with more men. And if he gets there a day earlier, those reinforcements have not come from Petersburg, and maybe he goes into the city for a few hours, but enough to really embarrass a president who's running for re-election. Now, another thing we ought to think about, too, with weather is we shouldn't just think about Civil War weather as bad weather. Sometimes good weather had a lot to do with the outcome of the war. My grandfather was a sailor for many years, and when he said it was fixing to weather, I love that phrase. When it was fixing to weather, it meant that bad weather was coming. But we need to think about good weather as well. No general ever had more perfect weather than William Tecumseh Sherman marching from Atlanta to Savannah. The temperatures weren't too hot, they weren't too cold. There was just enough rain to keep the dust down so that men didn't have to breathe it. It was perfect. When Sherman got to Savannah, he writes his report to Washington, and he admits one of the reasons we did this was that the weather was on our side. The great weather historian David Ludlam calls it Yankee weather. Couldn't have been better. And Sherman agreed that if the weather had been bad, maybe they wouldn't have made it. As it was a struggle to get through South Carolina over the next couple of months when the weather really did turn bad. But weather just doesn't happen in a vacuum. Snow, rain, hit the ground. And one of the things that I think we have to think about is the relationship between weather and the earth, weather and soil. And to me, this was one of the most interesting parts of my journey, trying to understand the importance of weather in the Civil War. There are all sorts of ways that you can describe soil. If you're a really good soil engineer, geologist, you can get down to a minute level and distinguish the soil between your backyard and your neighbor's. But if you want to go to the macro level, if you want to go to the most basic way of understanding weather, there are 12 different kinds of soil in the United States. They're called soil orders. And all of these soils act differently. Now I'm going to ask you a question, because I only quit teaching a few months ago, so I like to ask questions. I don't just like to stand and talk at people. When you look at this map of soil orders in the United States, different soils, does anything stand out to you? All that red clay, all that orange on the map, or in my photo to the upper right, technically called ultisol, red clay soil. Where do you see red clay soil? It's in the South, right? They used to talk about the sacred soil of the Confederacy. The sacred soil of the Confederacy was red clay ultisol. Not all of it, not Florida, not Texas, not along the Mississippi, not in parts of Kentucky. There are varied soils out there. But most of it's that red clay. When the rain hits the red clay, it becomes an absolute mess, as all of you know. Except in the 1860s, nobody really knew how soils had developed in the first place. Well before the war, abolitionists had concluded that southern red clay was just ruined soil. Those Southerners and their slave labor had not only ruined their morals, they had ruined their soil. Red clay to the abolitionist was literally immoral. It was a sign of immorality. And when Union soldiers got south, they discovered something else about red clay. And they wrote about it all the time. They called it bottomless. Bottomless. If you've ever been stuck out in a field trying to get a wagon out or a car out, you understand. Most soils at a certain level have enough vegetative content, gravel, what have you, that you finally get down to a solid layer and you can pull the car out, you can pull the wagon out. With red clay, that layer is so deep that it's useless to you if you're, riding a horse or marching down a road or trying to get an artillery piece and a caisson from point A to point B. It was to them bottomless. I used to read those stories about men coming across mules that had buried themselves up to their ears, and I thought, well, that's just fanciful. Except it's not. It's real. Now, here's an interesting thing about red clay, which I think is interesting. If you look at the map again on either side, you will see that there is a bit of red clay in the north. Not enough for most Union soldiers to have ever encountered it. But there's a little bit. There's a little bit in New Jersey. There's a little bit in Delaware and Maryland. There's a little bit in Pennsylvania. And it's kind of hard to see, but if you look at the southern border of Pennsylvania, about halfway in from either east or west, just a little orange finger poking up into Pennsylvania. I don't know if you can see that, but it's there. Do you know where that little orange finger of red clay ultisol goes? It runs smack dab into Little Round Top. Next time you're at Gettysburg, look, it's there. Something that Kent knows well, but maybe some of you don't. When Lee retreated from Gettysburg, the first thing he did was move across the mountains and then headed south toward Williamsport and Falling Waters. And that took him into different kinds of soil. Bad enough with all that rain, but manageable. George Meade decided to move down the turnpike. He'd rest his guys for a couple of days and then move south down the turnpike, which was great until the traffic jams inevitably happened. And you know, out on the interstate, there's always that guy who wants to go over on the shoulder and drive. And so people were pulling out of line, trying to get around the stalled wagon. And the Army of the Potomac went straight into that red clay. They made incredible progress the first day. They got over 20 miles. But when they got to the mountains, at least 2 corps didn't have enough horses to get all of their wheeled vehicles across because they had worn them out running them through that red clay. So the next time we think about George Meade, maybe we ought to think about the environmental context of the pursuit of Lee to the Potomac. Every battle, every campaign, every event, every incident on the home front was somehow shaped by what? The weather context, the environmental context of what was happening around them. So the last thing I want to say is this. When I first started this book, another book that I read, one of my colleagues recommended it, was a book by Mike Davis. It's called Late Victorian Holocausts. Obviously not beach reading. I can't imagine a more depressing title than Late Victorian Holocaust. Mike Davis, it's a controversial book, but I like it, was writing about the rise in imperialism. How was it between 1850 and 1914? A handful of European nations, the United States and Japan, basically took over the rest of the world. Why was it that by 1914 there was only one independent republic left in Africa? How was it that China had been dismembered? You know, when I used to teach this in world history, we would usually talk about technology. We would talk about machine guns and steamboats and quinine for malaria and telegraphs and all the technological advances of the West. And all those things are important. Mike Davis also pointed out that between 1887 and 1902, somewhere between 30 and 50 million people in this world starved to death as a result of either flooding or drought in China, in India, in parts of South America, in Africa. That all of those folks in what came to be called by 1914 the Third World had been weakened to an incredible degree simply by the weather and the inability of these new imperial governments to deal with the weather. All those people we've read about starving to death in India while those new British railroad trains went by carrying their grain to foreign lands. Mike Davis says we're never going to understand the rise of imperialism, the creation of the Third World. Probably can't understand the world as it exists today unless we understand those El Niños. And he calls that the secret history of the 19th century, a fact so basic that we forgot about it. Now, I don't claim to have written the secret history of the Civil War. But I think it is a secret history of the Civil War. That if we put the war back into its environmental context, if we put the war back into its weather context, I think it makes a little more sense. I think we understand it a little bit better. I think those decisions that seem odd to us suddenly make a little more sense. If we remind ourselves that weather has a kind of agency and that the Civil War was fought outside and everything that means. So that's all I have to say. Ken's going to come up here and help me if you have questions, and I hope you do. But I think that's the context of weather and climate in the American Civil War. So thank you.